Have you ever wondered what compels a man who has already survived 4 years of hell and earned enough medals to go home a hero to pick up a spool of wire and run straight into the mouth of certain death? It was 700 hours on the morning of January 24th, 1945, and the world was frozen solid. We are in the Alsace region of France, near the town of Husson, on the edges of what history would come to call the Colmar Pocket. This was not a place for the living. It was 850 square miles of snow-covered forest and farmland west of the Rhine River, the very last German-held territory on French soil. The Germans had held this ground since November, and they were desperate. The conditions were beyond miserable. They were lethal. For the men of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, the temperature had averaged 10 degrees below zero for days. There was no moonlight to soften the darkness, just the crushing white weight of snow that covered everything. These soldiers slept in frozen foxholes. If they could sleep at all, their bodies numb, their nerves frayed by the constant probing of German patrols that tested the American lines every single night. The battalion had been on the line for 18 brutal days. In just the last 2 weeks, they had lost 43 men, picked off by the relentless artillery and invisible snipers hiding in the frozen tree lines. Inside the battalion command post, 1st Lieutenant Garland Connor stood watching the destruction. He was 25 years old. To look at him, you might not see the face of a war hero. He was a slight man, standing only 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing a mere 120 pounds. Before the world caught fire, he had been a tobacco farmer from Clinton County, Kentucky, a young man who had never finished high school because the nearest schoolhouse was 15 miles away from his family's farm. But appearances on the battlefield are deceiving. Connor was an intelligence officer, a role that typically kept a man behind the front lines, working with maps, interrogating prisoners, and analyzing reports. Intelligence officers did not lead charges. They did not hunt tanks. Yet, Connor had not spent his war behind a desk. He had enlisted in March 1941, before Pearl Harbor, and had endured 4 years of war, surviving 10 major campaigns and 4 amphibious assault landings. He was a survivor in a profession that killed men quickly. He had been wounded 7 times. In fact, his last wound had sent him to the hospital only 3 weeks prior, and he had returned to his battalion just 2 days before this morning, his wounds still healing under his uniform. He carried a reputation in the 3rd Battalion that was as heavy as the steel pot on his head. When the situation turned desperate, Connor moved forward. He had already earned 4 Silver Stars for valor in places like Italy, Anzio, and France. Each of those stars represented a moment where he had risked everything to save others. Now, the situation was not just desperate, it was catastrophic. At 7:15, the silence of the frozen morning was shattered. The German artillery barrage, which had been picking at them, suddenly intensified. It was a preparation barrage, a curtain of fire designed to keep heads down while the hammer fell. Shells walked across the battalion's forward positions, exploding trees and sending fountains of dirt and frozen earth into the gray sky. For 12 minutes, the world was fire and noise. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. In the sudden, ringing silence, a new sound emerged, a deep, mechanical rumble that every infantryman in Europe dreaded. Tank engines. A runner burst into the command post, breathless and wide-eyed. The report was a nightmare scenario. The Germans were advancing. The German 19th Army had massed a counterattack designed to break the American spine. 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks were rolling out of the tree line, and behind them came 600 infantry troops. The battalion commander looked at his map and saw the inevitable. The attack was moving toward the battalion's left flank. The Americans had nothing to stop them. There were no Sherman tanks in position, no tank destroyers to ambush the German armor. If those 6 Tigers reached the foxholes, they would roll right over the American infantry, crushing them into the snow. The battalion would be overrun, and the line would break. There was only one weapon available that could possibly stop a Tiger tank: artillery. But artillery is a blind giant. It needs eyes. It needs a forward observer to call in the coordinates and adjust the falling shells. The command post was blind. The heavy timber of the forest blocked their view of the German advance. The forward observation post, the eyes of the battalion, had been obliterated by the opening barrage. The observers were either dead or too wounded to function. Connor studied the map. The German juggernaut was coming through a section of woods 400 yards away. The equation was cold and simple. To bring the artillery to bear, someone had to go out there. Someone had to run 400 yards across open ground, a flat, white killing field with zero cover, while German artillery rained down, and 600 enemy soldiers marched toward them. Connor didn't issue an order. He didn't ask for a volunteer. He picked up a telephone and a spool containing 400 yards of wire. He looked at his battalion commander, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, and then he walked out of the command post and into the snow. The German barrage had paused, but Connor knew the rhythm of the enemy. They were professional soldiers. They fired preparation barrages, waited for their infantry to close the distance, and then they would fire again to pin the defenders down while the tanks finished the job. He knew the shells would start falling again any second. He started to run. Imagine running in heavy combat boots through snow that has a frozen crust on top. With every step, your foot breaks through, catching your ankle, slowing you down. In his left hand, Connor gripped the heavy spool of wire, letting it unspool behind him like a lifeline. In his right, he held the telephone handset. He was a lone, small figure moving across a sea of white. He made it 100 yards before the German guns opened up. The Germans weren't firing blindly anymore. They had their own observers watching that open ground. They saw the lone American running toward their attack, and they adjusted their aim. Shells slammed into the earth, 40 yards to his left, then 30 yards to his right. They were bracketing him, walking the fire in to crush him. A shell screamed in and struck a tree 70 yards ahead of him. The tree didn't just fall, it exploded. Splinters of frozen wood and jagged branches showered down like shrapnel. Connor didn't flinch. He kept running. Another shell landed 20 yards behind him. The concussion wave hit him like a physical blow, a massive, invisible fist slamming into his back. He stumbled, his boots sliding in the churned-up snow, but he did not fall. The wire kept unspooling. At 250 yards, the world tried to stop him again. A shell obliterated a tree directly in his path, splitting the trunk down the middle. Half of the massive timber crashed across the snow, blocking his way. Connor didn't slow down. He vaulted over the fallen trunk. The air around him hissed as pieces of hot metal shrapnel buried themselves in the snow, melting the ice with their heat. He was closing in on the front line now, but the German aim was getting better. A shell landed 15 yards to his left. A geyser of frozen earth and snow erupted, raining heavy chunks of dirt down on his helmet and shoulders. The blast wave hammered his eardrums, shattering his hearing. Suddenly, the roar of the battlefield was replaced by a high-pitched, screaming ring. He couldn't hear his own breathing. He couldn't hear the crunch of his boots. He reached the American front line at the 300-yard mark. The soldiers, crouched low in their foxholes, looked up in disbelief. They saw an intelligence officer, a man who should have been safe in the rear, running toward the enemy with a telephone in his hand. They stared at him, but he didn't stop to explain. He couldn't. He ran past them. He ran past the safety of the line and kept going, 30 yards into no man's land, directly toward the advancing Germans. He found what he was looking for, a shallow ditch. It was barely a fortification. It was maybe 18 inches deep. It wasn't deep enough to stop a bullet, and it certainly wasn't deep enough to protect a man from artillery, but it was just deep enough to keep his silhouette below the snow level while giving him a clear sight line to the German advance. Connor dove into the ditch. His chest was heaving, his lungs burning from the cold air and the sprint. He checked the wire. Against all odds, it had held. He cranked the handset. A buzz, then a voice. It was the Fire Direction Center 3 miles behind the front line. They controlled 12 105mm howitzers. That was enough firepower to shatter an army, provided the shells landed in the right place. Connor gave his position. The fire direction officer confirmed. Lieutenant Garland Connor was now the eyes of the 3rd Battalion. He raised his head slowly above the rim of the ditch. 200 yards away, the forest was moving. German infantry in squad formations, rifles at the ready, were advancing in short, professional rushes. And behind them, pushing through the smaller trees like they were nothing but saplings, were the tigers. Massive, 60-ton monsters. He was alone, 30 yards ahead of his own lines, lying in a frozen rut with nothing but a telephone, while 600 soldiers and 6 tanks came to kill him. The battle was about to begin. How much power can a single human voice command when the sky is waiting to scream? Lying in that shallow 18-inch ditch, Garland Connor was about to find out. He was the only thing standing between the 3rd Battalion and total annihilation. A solitary figure carved into the frozen landscape, holding a telephone handset that felt like a block of ice in his grip. Connor raised his head just enough to clear the rim of the earth. The German infantry was 200 yards away now. They were moving with the terrifying discipline of veterans, squad leaders signaling men forward in short rushes, rifles traversing the tree line. They hadn't seen him yet. To them, the snow-covered field was just empty killing ground they had to cross. Connor lifted the handset to his lips. His voice didn't shake. He gave the coordinates. Enemy infantry in the open, 600 meters, adjusting. Then, the wait. In the world of artillery, time is measured in the agonizing seconds between the word and the thunder. 38, 39, 40. The air above the battlefield tore open. 12 105mm shells slammed into the tree line, but they landed 150 yards behind the German infantry. It was a miss, but only just. The German soldiers didn't even flinch. They kept coming. To them, artillery landing behind an advance was standard. It meant the Americans were guessing, firing blind into the woods. They thought they had time. They were wrong. Connor wasn't guessing. He could see every movement, every gray uniform against the white snow. "Drop 100, he said into the phone. "Fire for effect." 18 seconds later, the second salvo arrived. This time, there was no mistake. The shells landed directly in the center of the German formation. The forest simply disintegrated. 168 pounds of high explosive detonated simultaneously among 600 men packed into attack formations. The sound was a physical weight that pressed the air out of the valley. Trees shattered into razor-sharp splinters. Shrapnel screamed through the air in every direction. When the smoke drifted, the disciplined German advance was gone. The squad formations had broken apart. Soldiers were diving behind trees, crawling desperately away from the impact zone. The forest had become a slaughterhouse, but the relief was momentary. Because through the smoke and the flying dirt, the Tigers were still coming. The artillery that had devastated the infantry had not touched the heavy armor. The shells were high explosive, designed to kill men and destroy buildings, not to penetrate the thick steel hide of a 60-ton Tiger tank. The shells exploded around them, but the tanks just drove through the blast waves, massive and unstoppable. They broke out of the tree line and into the open ground. They were moving in a wedge formation, 2 in front, 2 behind, 2 in the rear. The tank commanders were standing in their turrets, confident, scanning the American lines for targets. Then the lead Tiger fired. The crack of its 88mm gun was sharper, louder than the artillery. It sounded like thunder snapping a whip. 300 yards to Connor's right, an American foxhole exploded. Dirt and snow geysered upward. The men inside were gone in an instant. Another Tiger fired. Another foxhole was obliterated. The panic began to rise in the American lines. There is a specific kind of terror that comes from being hunted by armor you cannot kill. The Tigers were 300 yards out. In 4 minutes, they would be on top of the foxholes. If they crossed that line, the battalion would collapse. It would be a rout, a slaughter of retreating men. Connor knew he couldn't stop them with brute force. He had to be precise. He shifted his fire mission. Enemy armor advancing, 250 meters. Adjust fire onto the tanks. He needed to thread a needle with a sledgehammer. He had to drop the shells not just near the tanks, but on them. Drop 50, fire for effect. The next salvo screamed down. The earth shook. One shell landed perfectly, slamming into the right track of the lead Tiger. The heavy steel links shattered. The massive tank slewed hard to the right, its momentum spinning it around until it ground to a halt. It was immobilized. But a disabled Tiger is still a fortress. Its turret traversed. Its gun was still hunting. And then, the dynamic of the battle shifted. The remaining tanks adjusted their course. They didn't pull back. They turned. The tank commanders had seen the muzzle flashes. They had spotted the thin black line of the telephone wire running through the snow. They realized that the pinpoint artillery wasn't luck. Someone was out there. Someone was directing the fire. They were coming toward the ditch. Connor watched as the massive steel hulls pivoted. They were 150 yards away now. He was close enough to see the Balkenkreuz markings painted on the turrets, close enough to see the faces of the commanders looking for him. He checked his cover. 18 inches of frozen dirt. It wasn't enough to stop a machine gun bullet, let alone an 88mm shell. He was trapped. If he ran, they would cut him down. If he stayed, they would crush him. The Germans were coming to kill the eyes of the 3rd Battalion. Connor gripped the handset tighter. He had one card left to play, and it was a card that no soldier ever wants to draw. He looked at the tanks, then at the ground in front of him. He keyed the microphone. "Fire on my position is the greatest act of love, laying down your life for your friends. even if the weapon you use to do it is your own artillery. The voice on the other end of the telephone line hesitated. The fire direction officer, sitting safely in a warm dugout 3 miles away, asked Connor to repeat the coordinates. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Calling artillery fire onto your own position was not standard procedure. It was a desperate, final act. It meant that friendly shells, American high explosives, would land within the lethal radius of the observer. It meant Connor was asking them to kill him to stop the Germans. Connor confirmed the order a 3rd time. He didn't scream it. He didn't panic. He just said it. 40 seconds later, the sky fell. The first shells landed 30 yards in front of his ditch. The concussion didn't feel like sound. It felt like a physical assault, like being hit in the chest by a speeding truck. The air pressure dropped so sharply that his lungs compressed, gasping for oxygen that wasn't there. His vision blurred into a gray haze. Above the rim of the ditch, the air was filled with the scream of shrapnel and the hiss of frozen dirt turning into lethal projectiles. It was the sound of the world ending. Connor stayed pressed into the frozen earth, the handset jammed against his ear. Drop 20. Repeat fire. The next salvo landed 20 yards out. He could feel the heat of the explosions on his face. Shrapnel tore through the air just 6 feet above his head. If he had stood up, he would have been shredded instantly. If the shells landed 10 yards closer, the ditch would become his grave. But the gamble worked. The Tigers stopped. The German tank commanders who had been hunting him moments before dropped into their turrets and slammed their hatches shut. Even inside 60 tons of armor, no crew wanted to be exposed when American shells were detonating at point-blank range. The tanks were buttoned up, blind and hesitant. But the German infantry was relentless. They were veterans, and they adapted. They began to use the massive Tiger tanks as mobile fortresses, walking behind the steel monsters, using the armor to shield them from Connor's rain of fire. They were regrouping, forming a company-strength element of nearly 200 men. Connor kept working the handset. He was playing a deadly game of geometry, walking the shells back and forth across the German advance. Every time a squad tried to rush forward, he dropped explosives on their heads. Every time the Tigers lurched forward, he called fire directly in front of their tracks. It was then that he realized he wasn't alone. A private from the Battalion Intelligence Section had low-crawled from the American foxholes, dragging extra telephone wire and a backup handset. He slid into the ditch beside Connor. He was a kid, terrified but determined, lying 5 feet to Connor's right, calling out target positions. They were a 2-man army in an 18-inch rut. But the war has no mercy for bravery. The Germans had pinpointed them. A shell landed 12 yards away. The blast wave lifted both men off the bottom of the ditch and slammed them back down. The private screamed. Shrapnel had torn through his left leg and blood began to pour onto the white snow, steaming in the freezing air. Connor grabbed the private and dragged him deeper into the shallow cover. The wound was bad, but the private refused to leave. He lay there, gripping his rifle, his leg bleeding out, still watching the tree line, still calling out the enemy movement. "German officer!" The private gasped, pointing. 30 yards. Connor looked up. A young German lieutenant was leading a final charge, just 30 yards away. He wasn't shouting. They were too close for that. He was using hand signals, guiding 20 soldiers in a skirmish line to overwhelm the ditch. They were close enough that Connor could hear the metallic click of their rifle bolts. Connor cranked the handset one more time. His hands were numb, shaking from shock and cold. He didn't adjust the fire outward. He brought it in, Drop 5. Fire for effect. The shells landed 25 yards away. The German officer vanished in the explosion. The squad behind him evaporated. Dirt and hot metal rained down on Connor and the wounded private. A piece of shrapnel slammed into the earth just 2 inches from Connor's hand. He didn't flinch. He couldn't. The Tigers were revving their engines again. They were 150 yards out, and they were angry. When the world disappears behind a curtain of smoke and snow, does a soldier fight with his eyes, or does he fight with his soul? Garland Connor was about to lose his sight, but he had no intention of losing the battle. The 2 remaining Tigers had closed the distance to 150 yards. They weren't just driving anymore. They were hunting. The bow gunners opened up with their MG-34 machine guns, weapons capable of spitting nearly 800 rounds per minute. The bullets chewed through the frozen logs of the tree line and kicked up violent sprays of snow around the American foxholes. The American soldiers returned fire, but rifle bullets against the frontal armor of a Tiger tank were as useless as throwing stones at a mountain. The Tigers kept rolling. Connor knew he couldn't penetrate their armor with the artillery he had left, so he decided to take away their eyes. He grabbed the slippery handset. "Mix smoke and high explosive," he ordered. Moments later, white phosphorus shells screamed down, exploding in thick, choking billows of white cloud. The Tigers disappeared into the chemical fog. For a moment, they were gone, but Connor could still hear them. He could hear the terrifying mechanical gnashing of steel tracks grinding through the frozen earth. The smoke hadn't stopped them. It had only made them invisible ghosts. Then the nightmare emerged. One Tiger burst through the smoke cloud, just 70 yards from the foxholes. Its 88mm main gun cracked, and an American machine gun position disintegrated, killing 3 men instantly. Connor didn't hesitate. He called fire directly onto the tank. "Danger, close," he shouted, reading coordinates that were terrifyingly familiar. The fire direction officer hesitated again. Those coordinates were within 50 yards of Connor's ditch, well inside the lethal shrapnel radius of a 105mm shell. Connor would be inside the kill zone. "Send it," Connor demanded. The shells landed. One hit 10 yards behind the tank. Another 15 yards to the left. Then a direct hit on the front hull. The explosion didn't pierce the armor, but it shattered the driver's vision port. Blinded and panicked, the 60-ton monster swerved hard to the right, crashing into a shell crater. The tracks spun uselessly in the mud. The tank was dead, but the German infantry was adapting. Using the smoke as cover, they began to flank Connor's position. He couldn't see them anymore. He lay in the bottom of the ditch, eyes squeezed shut, listening. He heard voices in the smoke. He heard boots crunching on snow. He heard the metallic click of weapons. He began to conduct the artillery like a deadly orchestra, guided only by sound. When he heard German voices to his left, he called fire left. When he heard movement to his right, he shifted the barrage right. Then came the news that every forward observer dreads. The battery was running out of ammunition. The officer on the line reported they had maybe 15 minutes of sustained fire remaining. After that, the guns would go silent, and the 3rd Battalion would be defenseless. Connor looked up. The last operational Tiger tank was 40 yards away from the American foxholes. It was close enough that its main gun could destroy the defensive positions one by one at point-blank range. The commander was standing in the turret, scanning for victims. Connor knew this was the end of the line. He called for everything. High explosive, maximum concentration, fire at will. He poured every remaining ounce of American firepower onto a single point on the map. 12 shells arrived simultaneously. The Tiger disappeared in a cataclysmic storm of fire and steel. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still there, the armor unbreached, but it was silent. The vision blocks were shattered. The optics were gone. The crew, blind and terrified, scrambled out of the hatches and ran for the tree line. The German armor was broken, but the infantry was still out there. Connor spent the final minutes of his ammunition walking shells across the retreat, ensuring the enemy didn't regroup, chasing them back into the forest. And then, 3 hours after he had walked out into the snow, the guns stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. No engines, no explosions, just the wind moving through the shattered trees and the faint, distant cries of wounded men calling for help. Garland Connor stood up. His legs were locked from hours of freezing cold. He helped the wounded private to his feet. Together, they limped back toward the American lines. Soldiers emerged from their foxholes, staring at the cratered moonscape where the battle had raged. They looked at the destroyed Tigers. Then they looked at the small, exhausted man walking out of the mist. The battle was won. But the war for Garland Connor's memory was just beginning. How do you measure the weight of a hero's silence? Is it measured in the years that pass without a word, or in the dust that gathers on a cardboard box tucked away in the back of a closet? Garland Connor came home. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but Connor was already back in Kentucky, discharged in June, trying to forget the sound of 88mm shells and the screams of dying men. His hometown of Albany threw a parade for him. Even Alvin York, the greatest hero of the First World War, came down from Tennessee to shake his hand. York understood what Connor had done. He understood the weight of the medals on Connor's chest. But Connor just wanted to go home. He met a woman named Pauline Wells at that parade. She was 20 years old, and she had heard the citations read aloud, stories of a one-man army who stopped a German breakthrough. She looked at the quiet, 5'6" farmer standing in front of her, and couldn't believe this was the same man. They married in July, just months after the guns went silent. They moved to a farm on Indian Creek with no electricity and no running water. They worked the land with mules, growing tobacco and corn, living the same life his family had lived for generations. And the medals, the Distinguished Service Cross, the 4 silver stars, the Purple Hearts, they went into a cardboard box. That box went into a duffel bag, and that duffel bag went into the dark of a closet. For 50 years, Garland Connor never spoke about January 24th, 1945. When neighbors asked, he told them he had left those memories across the Atlantic Ocean. When Pauline asked him once, early in their marriage, what he had done to earn all that silver and bronze, he simply looked at her and said, "I did what needed to be done." That was it. No bragging, no glory, just a job finished. He became a leader in his community, helping other farmers and veterans, but the warrior remained buried beneath the peace of the soil. Then, in 1996, the past came knocking. A man named Richard Chilton, researching his uncle who had died at Anzio, found Connor's name. He came to the Connor farm hoping for a story about his uncle. What he found was a legend hiding in plain sight. Connor was 77 years old by then, his body failing from diabetes and kidney failure. Sitting in his living room, Connor told Chilton about his uncle, and as he spoke, the old soldier began to weep. 50 years later, the grief was still as fresh as the snow in Alsace. Pauline brought out the box. Chilton opened it, read the citations, and his hands began to shake. He looked at the fragile old man and said the words that history had forgotten to say. This man should have been awarded the Medal of Honor, but bureaucracy is slower than war. Chilton and Pauline began a crusade, gathering eyewitness testimonies, filing paperwork, fighting a system that had moved on. The Army rejected them in 1997. They rejected the appeal in 2000. Garland Connor didn't live to see the end of the fight. He died on November 5, 1998, and was buried with his Distinguished Service Cross. The world thought the story was over, but Pauline Connor was a soldier's wife. She did not quit. For another 20 years she fought. She found men who had been in the foxholes that day, men who swore that Connor had saved the entire battalion. The case went to federal court, and in a moment that transcends the cold logic of the law, a government attorney, fighting against the award, broke down in tears during mediation. She realized her own father had served in the 3rd Battalion and might have been one of the men Connor saved. The dam finally broke. On June 26, 2018, 73 years after he ran into the snow, the White House opened its doors. Pauline Connor, now 89 years old, stood in the East Room. The President of the United States read the citation aloud. He spoke of the 400-yard run, the broken telephone wire, the Tiger tanks, and the moment a man called fire on his own position to save his brothers. He was the second most decorated soldier of World War II, right behind Audie Murphy, yet almost no one knew his name. As Pauline accepted the Medal of Honor, holding the blue ribbon that her husband had never sought, the silence was finally broken. It wasn't just a victory for a family. It was a restoration of history. Garland Connor's story reminds us that true heroism isn't about the applause you receive when you come home. It isn't about the ribbons on your chest or the parades in your honor. True heroism is doing the impossible when no one is watching, simply because it is right. It is the quiet dignity of a man who saves hundreds of lives, then goes home to plow a field, content to let his actions speak only to God. So, tonight, when you close your eyes, think of a frozen field in France. Think of a lone figure in a shallow ditch, holding a telephone, holding the line, holding back the darkness so that others could see the dawn. We must never let him disappear into the silence again.